You're listening to the Baha'i World News
Now
Service.
live local house of worship.
Pinilingkod kay Bahawi. In this episode, we explore insights from the Baha'i international community's efforts to contribute to the discourse on peace and global governance. In their conversation, the BIC representatives highlight spiritual principles that can illuminate paths toward genuine collaboration among nations, foster recognition of our shared humanity, and inspire new approaches to international structures that advance the common good of all people. We hear from Simin Fahandej from the BIC's Geneva office.
There are a number of conceptions that today exist in governing institutions that actually need to be redefined.
Hetem El Hadi from the Cairo office.
We must look at global governance from the lens of the oneness of humanity.
Bani Dougal from the BIC's New York office.
When we say oneness, I think we are not implying sameness. We are talking about unity and diversity.
Destia Naris from Jakarta.
Consultation is a means to allow us to achieve our collective purpose.
Rochelle Bayani from the Brussels office.
The adoption of coherent policies hinges on the ability of a joint reading of reality.
And Solomon Belay from Addis Ababa.
One part of the society cannot be happy while the other one is deprived of its basic survival.
From the Baha'i World News Service, this is In Conversation, a collective exploration of the practical application of Baha'i principles to the building of peaceful societies.
The Baha'i International Community's United Nations office was established in 1948, and we have been offering statements and contributions to the thought at the UN ever since then. And there have been numerous statements that we've issued and held events to talk about some of these principles and how they can be brought to bear on the discussions between governments. We even had a Baha'i Bureau in the 1920s at the League of Nations. So this is not something recent, but these are the ideas and principles that we've been offering ever since. So at the recent Summit of the Future in September 2024 in New York, the Baha'i International Community shared this statement, Embracing Interdependence, Foundations for a World in Transition, and invited the international community and the arbiters of global governance to reconsider the organizing principle of the oneness of humanity. And this is the core principle of the Baha'i faith. We believe that without this principle at the center of any governing system, we will not be able to have peace and security in the world.
I think that's very important, Bani, because when you analyze some of the conversations today around global governance, very often we're starting with this premise that humanity consists of distinct units, and each of these distinct units, they also have distinct interests. And so that then the purpose of global governance is to bring these distinct units together so that they can find mutual benefits. But then what you were saying, this notion of the oneness of humanity, basically means that we don't think that humanity consists of distinct units, but humanity is one single unit. We believe that this one single unit has just one single interest, and that basically the well-being of one part of the world is contingent upon that of the whole. So then a system like that looks very, very different from one that is just trying to negotiate compromise. Whatever system we're going to put into place, it must be a system that is designed jointly by everyone.
I really like what Rochelle mentioned about the fact that we must look at the global governance from the lens of the oneness of humanity and see as one organic system what kind of interdependence do we actually have between each other, right? The whole global body of humanity has got, yes, indeed, very diverse parts of it. We don't look the same. Even us around the table don't look the same. But we all have one common need for survival to start with, but not just survival, but to survive peacefully and to survive prosperously. That's what we need. This is our collective aspiration. So what kind of governance would enable us to do that?
In fact, Africa hasn't been on the table of the design of this international governance, or probably its contribution was very marginal. So now the BICID is trying to contribute what it can in the conversation that's happening around peace, security, and governance in the African context. We see also how the youth are enablers or probably disruptors of these things. So now the BICID is trying to work with the youth so that there will be a new vision of Pan-Africanism, which will participate in the generation application of knowledge in terms of the general or the universal governance system. So we hope the current youth, which is the largest population in the African continent, will contribute in the future for this general system of governance that the BIC is generally envisioning for the world.
I think there are a number of conceptions that today exist in governing institutions that actually need to be redefined if we want to reach this level of governance that we're talking about. And one of the most important ideas, I think, is the conception of power that exists. Currently, the way power is defined and is seen by perhaps those in power is seen as dominance, as a competition, the superiority over others, the collection of resources for one at the expense of others. But I think if we see power as actually the ability to release the capacity of humanity to guide, to help communities, societies to actually release the power of love, the power of unity, then the way we look at those in power would look at themselves and their role in society would be very different.
Just to add on what Simin just shared, I think the discussion on governance most likely shaped by this idea about the ruler and the governed and the developed and the underdeveloped. And I think this dichotomy conception in the arena of governance, I think it's limiting human power. In fact, there are these three main protagonists of societal progress, which is individual, community, and also institution. And in them lies power. And how can we channel that? So then with this spirit of embracing interdependence, we cannot pursue our collective aspiration until and unless we work together and embrace and acknowledge that we are actually created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. And consultation is a means to allow us to achieve our collective purpose.
I think unity is at the core of any governance. And unless the world leaders are united in this common understanding of the well-being of the whole, we aren't going to make much progress.
We're seeing more and more now in the world when the framework to which policies are being adopted is not that of oneness. They actually start undermining each other. And we're starting to enter more and more into a web of incoherence. We're seeing that even policies that are very well-meaning, such as the climate policy that is being adopted in one part of the world, then potentially, when it's not adopted with this idea of oneness in mind, that same policy that is well-intentioned has very devastating consequences, for instance, on the agricultural sector in another place of the world. And this idea that one place of the world would be superior to another is one that we really, really need to work to dismantle. Every part of the world has something irreplaceable to contribute to the whole, has irreplaceable insights as to how to solve humanity's challenges. And so how do we bring everyone around the table, everyone with their knowledge and their capacity to really try and solve humanity's global issues?
You know, in Africa now there has been so many charters, conventions, about thousands of them. They are not being implemented. Most of them are not being implemented because there is this idea of national sovereignty. African Union as a body, as an institution, cannot go into a certain state or nation, cannot force that state to implement those charters and conventions, even if still they have signed for it.
We are coming out of this time of polycrisis in the world, so many different, the pandemic and the wars and everything, which demonstrate that we are dependent on one another. We very consciously named our statement Embracing Interdependence, because it's to understand that very fact that we are all dependent on each other. It is one human family. And the resources of the globe are not equally divided. We are dependent on one another for various resources. And in the organizing of global affairs, it seems to be my interest first before yours. And that is what's, I think, one of the biggest impediments to attaining peace.
I think progress often hinges on the fact that we have different perceptions of what justice means in a particular situation. So, for example, the allocation of resources. For one place in the world, justice means that if I have a resource on my territory, I should be able to benefit from that resource. And from another perspective, for another place in the world, justice would mean, well, if I helped you extract this resource, and if I put everything into place to allow for this extraction, then I should also be benefiting to some extent from this resource. So I think there needs to be a conversation that is had with everyone involved, not just about the principle of justice, but really how does this principle apply in even the most specific of circumstances?
Yeah, actually, you were talking about how the distribution of resources, and one of the areas where we see this the most is actually in the area of food security. Because, I mean, we know that even today, the 21st century, there is hunger, malnutrition, starvation in so many parts of the world. The issue is not a lack of food or lack of resources. There's actually enough food to go around, essentially. The issue of food security is actually distribution of food. We see in many parts of the world that those that are producing the food are actually the ones that are benefiting from it the least.
The Baha'i International Community Addis office and Brussels office, together with a whole series of other organizations, both across Africa and Europe, have been thinking how can civil society organize itself across two continents and really come together to identify joint challenges, but also to read reality together. Because we often see that the adoption of coherent policies hinges on the ability of a joint reading of reality. And so what does it look like for the grassroots to read reality together? And I think this experience that we had with this, what we call a civil society engagement mechanism across those both continents, is very, very interesting, because it is the first time probably in history that we have the possibility to come together very systematically and try and look at a particular problem and then give each other's perspectives about this particular problem.
There's also the concept of competition. It seems like there are all these competing forces, and I want more, and if you have that, then I want it as well. We need to understand the relationships, the global relationships, in a collaborative manner, because it's only through collaboration that the common good is realized.
When we think all of this thing, while we are also trying to imagine what would be the governing system that allows everybody to progress. Like, one question is actually like what binds us together, because our relationship is very transactional, and it's all the way from our individual relationship to like government to government relationship. But then if we look at the community, at the grassroots, what kind of community that is of caring and loving to one another and happy for each other progress. So whatever you may be a leader, you may be also a cook, you may be a mother or a children, but really like we are created noble. So then how can we envision that pattern of relationship that really of support of one another? Like, how can government support the progress of its society? Like, what kind of policy that allow this immense potential of the society, of the community and individual be channeled?
Human beings, we have this spiritual nature and which identity. It's universal. That makes one, despite our differences in terms of language, race, whatever background, geography. We have that entity called the soul, also, which is a source of our spirituality. And because of that, everyone deserves a better life. Like everyone needs to have food, clothing, shelter, health and security. Just before we're spiritual beings, and because of that interdependence, the happiness and also the sadness of anyone depends on the other one. So one part of the society cannot be happy while the other one is deprived of its basic survival. So probably in our governance system, the leaders should be probably thinking of revising the idea of, for example, secularism. How it is put in terms of bringing a new perspective to governance. How can this idea of spirituality can illumine the thoughts and the practice that we have in the governance system.
Baha'u'llah, who's the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, actually wrote to the kings and rulers of the world during his time. He says the quality of a leader is to help with the growth of all. And that's very interesting if you think about, for example, a president or a prime minister of a country having that thinking of contributing or helping with the growth of all and what that really looks like. There's other qualities such as humility, for example. Not seeking power is another one, actually. Being in power, a service to humanity. And I think a deep contradiction that exists today in human affairs is actually the contradiction regarding human nature. So on the one hand, many people long for unity, for peace in the world. And on the other hand, they actually don't think that it's possible because they believe that human beings are selfish, that human beings will always want to compete. And so these two ways of thinking actually contradict one another. That how can we long for peace and want to achieve peace, but on the other hand, not think that it's attainable. And it's interesting because if you actually look into research, it actually shows the opposite of what many think is true, that actually over centuries, human beings are becoming closer to one another, that they are becoming more interconnected. Sometimes the steps that are actually taken to achieve unity and peace are very simple, such as rethinking the way each one of us around the world think of ourselves as human beings, that we are capable of achieving unity.
Definitely. I think we have to question every underlying assumption in the current paradigm of thinking that has brought us this low in international relations. Look at how many wars there are in the world. Look at how many people are dying every day. There are more than 50 wars around the world today. So we have to question the paradigms that have brought us thus far, including our existing thinking about human nature, and really imagine something different. And unless and until we start to think about our unity as a fundamental principle, our common identity as noble human beings that deserve not just lack of war, but we actually deserve prosperity, right? Unless we start looking at ourselves in these from a different lens, unless we recognize that as one organic system, we have interdependence on each other. We cannot see one part of the world being prosperous and comfortable and the rest of the world not. It will not be sustainable. So we have to re-question all these underlying assumptions and reimagine these principles of justice, these principles of oneness, these principles of equality with a different light. And similarly, re-examine our global institutions in a different way and really hold them accountable to creating the spaces and forums that enable proper consultation. And a key element also of those conversations is our global economy.
I was just thinking, as you both were speaking, that this idea of revisiting some of the assumptions we have about sort of human nature, it also applies to revisiting some of the assumptions about how, for example, our economic order should function. And if you analyze our current economic models, they're always based on this understanding that competition is the organizing principles around that model. So then how can we also revisit this idea of competition? Because we're very much realizing that this very idea is actually at the source of driving humanity in many ways to its limit, whether it comes to sort of the limits of climate, the limits of its resources more generally.
I think that peace is possible. And whether peace is going to come about as a result of horrifying conflicts or as a result of this constructive and consultative will is in a way up to humanity. And, you know, working all of us in one way or another in governing systems, whether international levels or regional levels, one aspect of that I often think about when I'm sitting in that UN hall is the idea of consultation and the capacity to consult. And I think that is also at the heart of coming up with solutions. And I think that capacity to learn to consult from different parts of the world is one that also the international community needs to come in a detached way and dispassionately examine existing global policies and think together as a world community about new structures, new policies that will serve all of humanity.
You've been listening to In Conversation, a podcast series from the Baha'i World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit bwns.org.